Hey everyone, welcome to the DevOps for Everyone session here at Code Rage. My name is Robert Warmack. I'll get a little bit more into my background here in a second, but I just wanted to welcome everybody here and let everyone know that we're especially excited about DevOps at Idera. It's really become a big topic of focus for us. We've actually acquired several companies in the space, and we're looking at building out the tooling, kind of with the idea developers are our superheroes, and we want to make developing, deploying, and running your code just as easy as a click of a button. So a little bit about me. I'm the Director of Technology here at Idera. I have a background in large-scale systems engineering and DevOps tech. I've been doing DevOps since before it was a buzzword for the last decade or so, working at various large companies, small startups. I worked at Google and spent the last several years in cloud infrastructure consulting, helping people move stuff to the cloud, kind of make use of these new technology tool chains, and really understand what it is we mean when we talk about using DevOps to improve your deployment and development processes. My big plans for the future, and one of the reasons I joined the Idera family when I did, is to simplify and improve the entire Idera developer experience, from writing of code to deploying it into production. It's something that I'm very passionate about, that I've helped a lot of companies with over the years, both as a full-time employee and as a consultant, and something that I think is really important to the developer tool chain and kind of developer ecosystem for any type of developer, be you a web app developer, a mobile developer, or a desktop application developer. DevOps is really still relevant to you and the way that you do things. So on the next slide, let's get a little bit into what is DevOps. DevOps is something that I think has been co-opted by the marketing types and turned into a real buzzword that can mean whatever the person wants it to mean at the time. But the true idea behind DevOps and what really kicked off this mindset and this kind of shift in the ecosystem is the idea of you build it, you run it. It's developers doing operations work. So traditionally, and I'm sure a lot of us have seen this in large corporations, there are silos. When you finish writing code as a developer, you throw it over the wall and say, hey, operations guy, put that in production, make sure it's there, make sure it has good uptime, make sure nothing fails, and that really is kind of wiped off your plate. The operations guy gets called at 3 in the morning when the server goes down, not you. The idea here is we think a developer should really be the master of their own code. They should know how it gets built. They should know how it gets deployed. They should know how it performs post-deployment. And we think that that's really kind of the crux of DevOps, and that's really what we're pushing for there, is just saying we need somebody who is kind of the master of all things this app or this code base, and can really take responsibility at any stage in the life cycle. Largely, corporations have been pushing towards this because it really has been shown to align incentives better for developers. Traditionally, developers say, hey, we're going to push as many features as possible because that's how we're graded, that's what our job is based on. How fast can we get new features out and make the product better? Traditionally, operations folk are very resistant to any sort of change. Their mantra was stability, stability, stability. You know, how do we keep these systems up? How do we minimize downtime? How do we meet our SLAs? So those two groups were really kind of in opposition when it came to both wanting to meet their goals at the expense of the others. And the idea with DevOps is that those incentives should be aligned, and everyone should be concerned not only with pushing features, but also with how those features actually impact the end user, and how those features make it into production, how that's gated, how that's built, how the various projects all going on at once get built in parallel and don't step on each other's toes. There's really a lot of pieces that go into developing complex applications, and the idea behind DevOps is that the person who writes the code, who better to manage that code through its entire life cycle. So DevOps is a spectrum. Small businesses, honestly, have been doing DevOps for years. When you're a one-man shop or a two-man shop, you may both be developers, but the code's got to get into production. It's got to be run in production. Customer issues need to be taken care of. You know, you're doing DevOps when you are in that kind of space, just because Maybe you don't have the budget for a full operations team, the financial budget. So it comes out of your time budget. You say you spend X amount of time working on operations, even though you're a developer. For larger corporations, this has been slower coming because they have much larger departments. There's a lot more vested interests in kind of keeping the status quo. There's probably an entire operations team that reports to a different place in the company than the entire development team. So bridging that gap can be very difficult because it's truly rethinking the mindset to pare back some level of specialization and say that people need a full generalized understanding and knowledge of the code they write and how that code actually works. So larger organizations have been slower to adopt. They're kind of on the left-hand side of this diagram we have down here, but they've started to shift to the right and see the benefits of aligning those incentives and really developing that generalized expertise so that someone can troubleshoot app issues or code issues at any stage in the development and deployment process. On the next slide, we will be going a little deeper into what things looked like before DevOps, and then we'll go into what things look like after DevOps. So traditionally, this kind of shows us a simplistic workflow of what app development and app management would look like in a developer toolchain. You would traditionally have developer, QA, sysadmin, and DBAs, all living in different groups, all having different reporting structures, but all responsible for different components of what finally gets deployed. Developer tools traditionally flowed into operations tools before any changes were made in the final environment. Testing tools integrated largely with operation tools before anything was pushed into the final environment. And DB tools kind of had this side access into production because databases are managed a little differently than code in standard architectures. They were really the only other group that was directly having tools interfacing with what was going on in production. Nowadays, we can see on the next slide that DevOps has changed things a little bit. DevOps Today is really showing all of these tool sets merging into a single unified tool set. Tools in the past that have primarily done work for databases or primarily done production deployments or primarily run tests have kind of started to horizontally integrate. So most tooling in the market no longer falls into one of these little individual buckets based around the previous silos. Nowadays, everything is considered a DevOps tool, and the DevOps tool manage that, not only the process or the flow of building and pushing an app into a production environment, be that behind a web server, be it on an FTP server, be it in an app store, whatever it may be, the operations or publishing tools traditionally have handled that, but now they also handle feedback. So we have a whole crop of new tools springing up that say, well, once this has been pushed into production, what does that mean for us? Let's go beyond kind of the uptime metrics and talk about how many conversions this made us, how well our customers accepted this, if our customers don't like this, if this new feature has caused all sorts of crashes. All these sorts of things are really invaluable feedback for developers to really understand what it is that they're writing, how their app functions, and how it doesn't function. So DevOps has really started to say we're going to play in those spaces between what were the traditional silos and find a lot of value in just making people's deployment and running of applications more smooth and work in a kind of more seamless way, fewer manual steps, more automation, and more kind of determinacy or having things always turn out the same way whenever you kick off a deploy or you run a new process. So you don't miss running tests. You don't build using the wrong CLI flags. You don't do these kind of simple human errors that are easily avoided. And overall, you end up with a much more efficient development tool chain. So from there, let's talk a little bit about what DevOps really means and what some people think of when they hear DevOps. So as I mentioned before, DevOps is really focusing on what were traditionally the biggest trouble areas, the handoffs and the integrations between systems. How do we take code, make sure it gets tested, and then make sure that that same code that got tested gets deployed in production? How do we manage code changes over time? How do we efficiently version control what it is we're writing? How do we keep track of what has been run through our test suite and what hasn't been run through our test suite? All of these places where people have traditionally tracked things manually in spreadsheets, they've zipped up code files and uploaded them to an FTP server. We've all gotten the naming scheme, program, final, version 2, version 3, update, 10.13. People find really inventive and interesting ways to manage this change in the absence of a tool that can do so in a meaningful and kind of innately understandable way. So DevOps tools really focus on this. They say, how do we make the integrations easier? How do we make the handoffs smoother? How do we avoid human error in these various processes? So to do that, to remove human error, the natural response is to automate everything, create repeatable processes. So this is why DevOps is really relevant to everyone. It's found its way into kind of the mainstream consciousness of web development, but it doesn't matter if you're a web developer or a mobile developer or a standalone desktop app developer. You can still take this mindset and begin to apply this tooling to make your processes more efficient, to save you time, to reduce the number of errors created from the time code is written until the time it's running in production. And to do that, you start removing the human element by automating everything. So I guarantee that any shop of larger than 1 or 2 developers is going to have some sort of automated build scripts, whether that's running make command to build your C files, or whether that is compiling on Xcode so that you can get it signed to get into the Apple App Store. All of these pieces, people are largely automating by hand, by just scripting using Bash or whatever your preferred scripting language is, to then manually kick things off by hand and get something pushed where it needs to go. DevOps is more about giving a framework, so you no longer have to have Bash scripts that manage everything. You now have one centralized place, preferably stored with your code, so it's really easy to determine how something is supposed to be built and how it's supposed to be used, and doing it in a way that is infinitely repeatable. You know, it's idempotent. It will always give you the same result, and it will eliminate those costly human errors that come from having to do these things manually, as well as in the long term saving your developers and your IT folks an inordinate amount of time. And it has the added benefit of making it significantly easier to train new developers and get them up to speed and contributing quickly when everything has been removed from institutional knowledge that your senior devs just have in their head and placed in a codified, understandable way so that any new developer can immediately build the application to test whatever code they may be pushing. So there's a lot of benefits here to getting people to start thinking about things with a DevOps mindset. That being said, deployment and publishing, as it's known in some industries, are really what a lot of people have started to think of when they think of DevOps. How do I take my code, compile it, build it, package it in a meaningful way, and then deploy it out to production? Now, while that is a key piece of what is automated in DevOps and what is different for developers moving into a DevOps space, that's not all that DevOps is. There's a lot of people who say kind of the buck stops there. DevOps is actually deploying your code, but that's not true. DevOps is a much larger concept than that. It certainly encompasses how you automate and deploy your code in a way that is repeatable and that always gives you the results you're looking for. But that's really not the entirety of what's going on. DevOps really, and DevSecOps, which is the idea of combining a strong security focus with DevOps, really push further upstream, further up in your tool chain, and now largely impact people from the time they start writing code until they are iterating on a production issue. It really touches every link in that chain. And really, one of my favorite things to say about DevOps is it's the democratization of the development process. You know, with great power comes great responsibility. It's true. When you need to get called out at 3 a.m. because your code is broken and the server is crashed, those are the tough times. But in trade for that, you have a much better understanding of what it is you're developing, how it gets used, you know, even what features people find meaningful, and the trade-offs between performance there and how much infrastructure it takes to support that, and you know, which end machines users can run that efficiently on. All of those sorts of tidbits of knowledge that really only came from chance interactions between the various silos and groups before are now kind of codified in the engineer's head. You know, it says you have full control of the process, and with that full control of the process comes the necessity to have the knowledge to understand that entire process and understand how changes could ripple through that. So there's a lot of benefit here as far as developers' mindsets as well, to make sure that developers, even at large organizations, approach things how a developer at a small shop would approach things, with an eye to the bottom line, an eye to how it affects customers, and really an understanding of how things perform in the wild beyond what they see in their own test lab. And I think that is one of the biggest benefits and most meaningful impacts that the DevOps movement will have. We'll look at what a sample DevOps toolchain could look like for you know, a standard user of Delphi or C++ Builder. In this specific case, I've highlighted SVN because we have some great tooling around SVN, but also you'll see there's a few Git user tools in here as well. So you start out with your IDE. These are the usual suspects, what you're familiar with. This is your RAD Studio, your C++ Builder, whatever it may be. You write your code, you test your code locally, everything looks great. The next step is, where do we go from there? Things look great, and we want to do something meaningful with that. So the next step is to push that code. So Cornerstone, for anyone who's not aware, is an SVN client for Mac OS users. It's under our Assembler umbrella, so we have a lot of standing in the SVN community. We have some of the core SVN devs on staff. It's a place that we take very seriously, and that we think is ripe for growth. So you push your code, and where does your code go? So traditionally, people would have FTP servers. They would zip up their code file, give it a version number or a name, upload it to their FTP server. That's their version control. If they need to roll things back, you're manually picking out code, you're rolling things back by hand. Or local storage. So if you have a you know, network attached storage drive or a SAN or something like that, where maybe multiple people can share the files, you would zip them and upload them there. Or honestly, I've seen it all too many times where shops have no version control at all, and the code is very haphazardly backed up and stored, which can be obviously a huge disaster should something go wrong, a computer crash, a lost hard drive, that sort of thing. So you push the code to Assembler, which is our offering for hosting your own Subversion or Git or Perforce repositories in the cloud. So we would take all of that off your hands. You wouldn't have to worry about uptime there or backups or any of those sorts of things. Or a more familiar player in the space like GitHub does the same sort of thing. It's a multi-tenant architecture. It gives you a place to store your code so that you can kind of check the box there of, if everything were to die tomorrow, there's still our code out there. We have not lost the IP. We have not lost the assets. We have not lost the code there. We can still rebuild if everything were to go wrong locally. From there, the next step is to automate your builds. So there's a lot of tools out there. Jenkins is probably the most familiar to a lot of people in the space. It's essentially just a scripting engine that lets you automate the way that you take code and you create final assets out of that, whether that's running tests against it, whether it's running builds against different architectures, whatever that may be. You have your self-managed Jenkins, or if you wanted to use a new vendor in the cloud who would manage the servers and such for you, you can use someone like Travis CI. What these do is they tie into your version control system, and they look for updates essentially. And whenever updates happen, they queue off a predetermined or pre-coded behavior on how that should be managed, whether that's running tests, creating preliminary builds, pushing to staging, pushing out to a partner's FTP server, building and pushing the app to the App Store. You can really, the sky's the limits here. You can code whatever you want within these tools to make sure that your build process is automated and repeatable and stable. Interesting piece on this is these also give you a nice place when they're out in the cloud to create all sorts of interesting integrations. So right now, people largely test things locally. There may be some level of test-driven development where you try to create tests for every new feature you push in. But there's a whole suite of other tools out there, like our tools TestRail and our tools Keyone, which help you manage test case. They help you ensure that you have full test coverage over your entire app. Something like TestRail is used by a lot of largest and smallest organizations in the world to do that kind of quickly and efficiently. Keyone's a company that focuses on security scanning, so it will actually look at your code. It will look for potential vulnerabilities. It will compare your open source dependencies to the known vulnerability databases out there to tell you when one of your dependencies have a known vulnerability. Do all sorts of interesting new things to make sure that your code is being tested for security as well as for feature completeness. So once all of these integrations have run, which give you all sorts of new and interesting ways to improve your efficiency, improve your security, and generally make sure that your product is as high quality and well tested as possible, the next step from these kind of hubs of DevOps is to actually push the code to production. So if you're pushing behind an Apache web server, if you're pushing to Amazon S3, if you're pushing to the App Store, if you're pushing to an end app server, like would be hosted by MyGit, an example there is say you have a Maven server if you're a Java developer, or say you have a NuGet server if you are a Microsoft developer. You want to build your packages and push those out so that either other users internally or external users can access those packages. That's what MyGit gives you, is that they will host those sorts of package servers for you. So your Jenkins or your Travis CI would push out to kind of that final state to say, hey, this has been tested, it was developed, it was tested in various ways, and it was built according to our standard blueprint. This is now ready for production or staging or whatever it is. This is ready to go out to somebody, and it makes sure that gets done in a repeatable way, and it surfaces any errors that it comes across so that you can address them quickly, as opposed to running things manually on a server and having to figure out if your local configuration has changed or what it may be that's causing an issue for you. So that's a sample DevOps toolchain that somebody who's a user of either Delphi or C++ Builder or any of our products could use to really improve their toolchain, make sure that things are working smoothly, make sure that things are automated, make sure that nothing unexpected happens during your build and deploy process, and when it does, that you can handle it appropriately. So that being said, my next slides here, I just kind of wanted to reemphasize what I said earlier. Idera is all about DevOps. We're really excited about it. We see how it improves developers' lives. We see how it improves code and generally makes the ecosystem a better place to be. We have all of these brands that we show here on the side, a lot of which are very specifically focused on improving the DevOps space and making things easier to use and easier to build. But really, we're just excited to hear from you. We want to know what you think our tools could be better to make your DevOps story easier. Or we want to know what you've tried, what's worked and what hasn't worked. We're really just excited to dig into the space further and really have a good understanding of what challenges and problems our customers face that we can help solve for them. So please, I would hope each of you would feel free to reach out to myself or any of your familiar kind of SEs or anybody on the ground who you've been working with at any of our various companies to kind of discuss the idea of DevOps and what it could mean for your company, what what has worked and hasn't worked for you in the past, and really what the best path forward is, because it's something we're very excited about and we're happy to help. That being said, I think now it's time to leave it open for questions.